Welcome to Explosive Enterprises. In a previous video, we went through GBB 101, explaining how a gas blowback airsoft gun works. Now that we've covered how they physically operate, today it's time to walk through common myths, misunderstandings, and best practices relating to the function of gas guns. Once again, we'll start with magazines. Online, we usually see airsofters advise that you must keep your magazines filled with gas to maintain the seals, and yeah, if you're relying on oil to keep the seals lubricated, it does help prevent the oil from creeping out. But we have HPA regulators, HPA tapped magazines, hand grenades, 40mm grenades, gas shot shells, and fill nozzles, and all of these seal up fine despite being stored unpressurized. The key is the use of grease rather than oil to lubricate the seals as needed, and our gas magazine maintenance guide covers how to apply it. All that said, there's no reason to purge a magazine that still has some gas in it, and we do advise keeping magazines gassed for storage, both because it makes it easier to gas up for play, and because it will allow you to detect if a magazine has a slow leak. And as we mentioned in the previous video, the amount of gas in the magazine does not change the vapor pressure, so there's no need to worry about exactly how much gas is in the mag before storage. However, when you go to play, it is necessary to avoid overfilling the mags. If a magazine has too much liquid propellant and not enough gaseous headspace, it may suck liquid up into the gun. This will manifest as big clouds of gas coming out the ejection port or barrel, along with significant cooldown and poor efficiency. Worse, if there's too little gaseous headspace, the liquid will not have space to expand into as it warms up, and rather than maintain that consistent vapor pressure as we talked about in the previous video, the pressure inside the mag will skyrocket. This will often manifest as light striking, where there's too much pressure on the release valve for the gun to open it fully or even at all. Most magazines are difficult to accidentally overfill at room temperature, and if this happens only once in a while, you can just vent a bit of gas to immediately solve it, but if you're regularly overfilling mags, there are a few things to try. First, if filling until you no longer hear gas flow is resulting in overfilling, switching to a time-based system of filling for a set number of seconds may work better. The challenge here is that it's difficult to track how much gas is in the magazine at any given time, so topping off a partially filled magazine can still result in overfilling. Second, tracking the weight of a magazine makes it easy to gauge how much gas is in it. A digital scale can be used to weigh the mag empty, and then once you know how much an empty mag weighs, figuring out how much gas it contains is as simple as subtracting the empty weight from its current weight. Obviously though, this is not particularly convenient in the field. Hold on guys, I just need to regas my mags, give me a minute. And third, most practically, just be aware of temperature differences. Because the vapor pressure inside a tank or magazine depends on the temperature, a situation where the tank is at higher pressure than the magazine, or vice versa, will have a significant impact on how much gas gets into the magazine. A magazine that's warmer than the tank will accept very little gas, while one that's colder than the tank is much easier to fill to the point of overfilling. As an extreme example, I've taken two identical mags and emptied both, and then heated one in a food dehydrator while chilling the other in the refrigerator for 30 minutes. The warm magazine, when filled, accepts a total of 7 grams of gas, while the cold magazine accepts 35 grams, which is actually overfilled since these VFC magazines hold about 25 grams without siphoning. A magazine filled right after shooting, while it's still cold, is much easier to fill or overfill, while a magazine that's been sitting in the sun or against your body when it's cold out may accept very little gas at all from a cold tank. If all else fails, you can always purge a magazine to empty it, then fill for around 5 seconds, and for most guns that ensures sufficient gas to clear all the BBs without overfilling. Adjust the fill time up or down as necessary. Purging magazines like this is wasteful, but will not harm the valve or O-rings, and this process quickly chills the magazine so it can readily accept gas. Relating to that, if a magazine is brand new and filled with room temperature air, it can be difficult to get a good fill. The easiest fix is to simply hold down the release valve while injecting gas from an upright tank for a few seconds, which purges the contained air but more importantly chills the magazine. Then fill normally. Anyways, speaking of cooldown, there's a myth that a plastic shell is good for preventing cooldown because it insulates the magazine, and sure enough, if you touch a plastic mag after shooting, it doesn't feel as cold as a metal one. But that's actually a bad thing because it means the magazine is not pulling heat from the surrounding environment to come back up to room temperature. The gas is staying cold inside its insulated shell, just like a cold drink in a thermos, whereas a magazine that feels cool to the touch is actively drawing in heat from contact and returning to ambient temperature. So if minimizing cooldown is a goal, opt for metal magazines rather than plastic. Now we move on to the gun, and I feel irresistibly compelled to address my favorite myth, short stroking for efficiency. For those who are not familiar, short stroking is the practice of putting spacers in the gun to reduce how far the carrier or slide can travel, causing it to hit that limit sooner and thus return forward sooner, and the myth is that this improves gas efficiency. As we covered in the last video, once the carrier or slide resets the hammer or trips the valve knocker release, no more gas is coming out of the magazine, and it does not matter how much farther the carrier or slide can travel. The gun is not consuming any gas while it finishes the cycle on residual pressure and momentum, so how much further it can travel has no impact on efficiency. However, usually a gun is short-stroked by adding spacers that compress the recoil spring, and this increases the tension keeping the carrier or slide forwards. That means it will take more pressure in the nozzle to force it back, which takes more time to build up, which ultimately causes the gun to consume a little more gas than when it was full-stroked. It's not much, but you're not getting an efficiency boost. And the farther the gun is short-stroked, the less over-travel the nozzle has beyond the feed lips, which can cause issues with feeding. So in theory, the effect of short stroking is simply to make the gun cycle faster at the cost of slightly worse efficiency. In practice, the most common effect of short stroking is another barely functional gun sold on hop-up is fully upgraded. Moving on. Next, there's a common misconception that the nozzle needs to stay stuck in the hop-up for the gun to function well, and that if it pulls out of the hop-up too easily, that means it isn't sealing and will be less efficient. Well, first, during the blowback cycle, the pressure inside the nozzle is keeping it forwards whether it's sealing well in the bucking or not. And second, once the rocket valve closes, no more gas is going out the barrel, so the bucking to barrel seal has no effect on efficiency anyways. A bad seal will manifest as inconsistent FPS, but we caution against heuristic tests like seeing whether the nozzle sticks. A good seal may not stick at all, while bucking that's being distorted into an oval shape may grab the nozzle but still not seal well. The seals that do matter for blowback are the nozzle to router seal, the nozzle to carrier or nozzle to piston seal, proper functioning of the rocket valve to seal off the front of the nozzle, the return spring plug seal for systems that use an internal extension spring to pull the nozzle back, and in the case of plastic nozzles, the integrity of the nozzle itself. If any of these are degraded, it will manifest as sluggish cycling, poor recoil, poor efficiency, or just dumping the gas out after a few shots. We recommend following our gas blowback maintenance guide to ensure proper care of the O-rings, but the rocket valve bears a closer examination. A common modification that can cause issues is nozzle restriction with something like a low-flow disc, typically done to reduce power. Creating a bottleneck at the front of the nozzle causes pressure to build in front of the rocket valve, and this back pressure can delay or even prevent the valve from closing. Not only is that counterproductive for reducing power and tends to induce joule creep, but if the rocket valve stays open while the nozzle is trying to push the carrier or slide back, it's essentially introducing a major leak. There are two better ways to reduce power. First, if the rocket valve is a typical hollow design, reducing the inner diameter of the valve will reduce the power. Because the restriction is now in the rocket valve rather than the nozzle, pressure building behind it helps to close the valve sooner, and the combination of reduced throughput and quicker closing very effectively reduces the amount of gas going out the barrel. The other method is to shim the backside of the rocket valve so that it starts farther forwards, which in turn closes it sooner. We usually only do this with rocket valves that the previous method won't work on, because this method tends to become less consistent the lower you go, which is part of why adjustable valves have a reputation for being inconsistent. Speaking of which, if you do buy an adjustable valve and you find you need to nearly fully close it to stay under power limits, you can shim the interior to reduce its throughput, and this essentially shifts the entire range of adjustment of the valve. I just mentioned joule creep, and it's worth an explanation. While this isn't specific to gas guns, it affects them more commonly than AEGs. Basically, for many gas guns, using heavier BBs will output higher joules than lighter BBs. The reason for this is simple. If the gun is pushing enough pressurized gas through a short enough barrel, a light BB may exit the barrel while the gas is still expanding, whereas a heavy BB takes longer to accelerate and stays in the barrel longer, receiving more energy before it exits. Not all guns will do this, and it depends on a lot of factors that are outside our power to easily control, but the shorter the inner barrel, the more likely you are to run into joule creep. For this reason, we advise against the practice of installing shorter inner barrels to reduce power, and instead recommend adjustable rocket valves whenever possible to ensure direct control over power output. Moving on, there are a couple of parts in the gas blowback process whose function may not be immediately apparent, and we sometimes see airsofters omit things they really shouldn't. The nozzle return spring is a common one, usually left out after it breaks and the owner realizes the gun still seems to work. However, without a return spring to ensure the nozzle fully retracts, the nozzle may not align properly, and this can cause feed issues or even damage to the nozzle or hop unit. Worse, it can even feed a BB and seal with the hop up while still being at least partially forwards, then the carrier or slide collapses onto it. With the magazine sealing off the bottom, the trapped air inside the nozzle has nowhere to go but out the front, and this can unseat or even prematurely fire the BB that just chambered. Some guns are more susceptible to this than others, but in general, it's best to keep that spring intact. Finally, there's a point we want to make with the fire control group, because I sometimes see players omit the auto sear on certain guns and remark that, hey, the gun still shoots full auto just fine. I then ask whether they've chronoed the gun or actually tested it at range, and that's usually where the conversation ends. The reason for this is that on most designs, the auto sear does not enable full auto per se, rather it prevents the hammer from falling until the carrier is all the way forwards. Without this, the hammer will follow the carrier and push the valve knocker before the carrier is fully in battery, and usually this will manifest as a gun that produces low or wildly inconsistent power in full auto. Auto sears aren't optional, leave them in. And note that you can also experience the exact same behavior in a pistol if the disconnector is missing or sufficiently worn as to be non-functional. The hammer will fall as soon as the slide comes forwards again, and this produces full auto, but again with inconsistent power. For other performance characteristics and a couple of efficiency myths, we suggest checking out our gas blowback winterization video, as the tweaks that optimize for cold weather will also improve efficiency in general. And just as a guiding principle, we suggest only changing parts when necessary to correct problems, or with a clear performance benefit in mind, as upgrading for the sake of upgrading is an easy way to introduce problems. Hopefully these videos will help you to identify and correct issues, and avoid spending money on unnecessary fixes, and as always, thank you for watching.